Hello everyone and welcome once again to The View from the Midwest. It's time for another bleeding blue look at the NHL Central. So let's get right into it. Some of the news going around this week that was pretty interesting. The Chicago Blackhawks made a splash in the trade market with our first real trade of the 2016 offseason. Now, obviously, there have been a few other minor workings with players going different places, but the Chicago Blackhawks made the first big splash, or perhaps I should say the Carolina Hurricanes made the first big splash as they picked up Brian Bickell and Teuvo Teravainen. And all Chicago received in return was a second-round draft pick in this year's draft and a third-round draft pick in the 2017 draft. Now, obviously, this was a pure salary dump, and Teravainen was basically just kind of the extra sauce that had to be added to the deal for Carolina to get it done and get that salary picked up, because Bickell was getting paid way more than he was worth. I talked to some people that I know, that my family members that are up in Chicago, and they basically said that when Bickell's contract was up, he had a real good playoff year, and the Blackhawks decided to reward him for it. They were hoping that he would be able to carry that over into the next few seasons. He did not. He did not surpass what he had done in previous seasons either, so it was kind of a head-scratcher to figure out why he had gotten about $4.5 million per year with a salary hit of just under that. And this is the kind of thing that happens when you give those kind of contracts out. And obviously you do want to reward your players, especially when they come up big for you in the playoffs. But Teravainen, although his stock had dropped a little bit, he's still got a lot of upside. And to lose a player like that simply because you have to get rid of a different player to afford some of the other pieces that you want to keep around, it's kind of the downfall of the salary cap structure. So the Chicago Blackhawks are going to be short a little bit of speed next year. Teravainen was a decent speed player, and he seemed to be fitting in pretty well on that line that he was with. But he's going to be a big pickup now for the Carolina Hurricanes. The Chicago Blackhawks also re-signed Richard Panik, and over at blackhawkup.com, they were making the case that that is an excellent signing. To me, it's just a signing. I'm not going to pretend that I follow the Chicago Blackhawks on a daily basis, because I don't. But from an outsider's point of view, I understand that you want a little bit of toughness, which Panik is going to bring if he's put on that first line. But a lot of teams are going to sit there and say, if you're going to put Richard Panik on your top line, we'll take that, because that gives us an opportunity to focus a little more on Jonathan Toews and whoever else they choose to put up there, whether it be Patrick Kane or some of the other younger players that moved their way up onto the top line. So, from an outsider's point of view, putting Richard Panik on the top line is perfectly fine. That doesn't do anything to dissuade the idea that you can stop that line a little bit easier. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. He might not even be on the top line. It'll depend on who Chicago wants to get in there, who they sign of their own free agents, and what their 2016-17 lineup looks like. The Dallas Stars realized that nothing was materializing between them and defenseman Alex Goligoski, so they ended up trading his rights to the Arizona Coyotes in return for a fifth-round pick in this year's draft. In addition, Jason Clark over at the Dallas Stars website wrote that the Stars are very likely to let all of their free agents explore the market and see what they can get out there. Obviously, the Dallas Stars would like to keep one or two of them. You have to figure, because they had a lot of free agents coming up on the blue line. You had Goligoski and Chris Russell for sure, and it seemed like there were two, maybe three other people that were also free agents for Dallas that were reasonably key pieces. Now, I understand that the Dallas Stars have some guys coming up through their pipeline that are going to be pieces for the future, so you can understand that a little bit. It's kind of what the Blues did last season by letting Barrett Jackman walk, letting some of their younger defenders come up and see what they they could do, and it obviously ended up being the wise decision. But 4 players along the blue line, at least 3 players, I'm almost sure, but up to 4, letting them go, that seems a little bit excessive right now for Dallas. Trades seem to be the theme of the week for the Minnesota Wild on Gone Puck Wild. Apparently there are rumblings that backup goaltender Darcy Kemper could be traded, as well as Jason Zucker. Now, Zucker's likely to be more of an additional piece in a larger deal, whereas the Kemper trade would be kind of interesting because it would kind of leave the Minnesota Wild a little bit thin at goaltender, because they have a lot of pieces similar to the St. Louis Blues in the pipeline, to where they have a lot of confidence that those players are going to be pieces for the future, but there's very little NHL experience, if any, right now in the minor leagues for the Minnesota Wild. So getting rid of Kemper would be an interesting decision. Obviously, it would show a lot of faith in the guys that they have down there, unless they need to bring in kind of a one-year stopgap type of player to get those guys a little bit of extra grooming time in the minors. So that would be an interesting situation for the Minnesota Wild to see what they do in net there. Zucker, as I mentioned, is going to be the piece in a larger deal if that gets worked out. And speaking of larger deals, the Boston Bruins seem to be the trade partner that the Minnesota Wild want to work with the most, but that's kind of true of everybody. It seems like Boston and Edmonton are really the 2 teams that are named with just about every team that's looking to trade something away, because those teams have probably some of the most attractive pieces. On Gone Puck Wild, they talked about Marchand, and the other name is escaping me. But obviously Louis Eriksson is potential, but I don't necessarily see the need in trading for draft or trading for negotiating rights. If you know that the player is likely to sign there, then maybe. But other than that, I don't see the idea of getting rid of prospects or draft picks in the hopes of signing somebody. But basically, it's just kind of an idea that Boston and Edmonton seem to pop up. They've obviously been the 2 names that the Blues have seemed to kind of been paired with. Minnesota seems to be that way. Nashville seems to kind of fall in the same boat. A lot of the teams around this area seem to be kind of focusing on Edmonton and Boston. Well, they're not going to be swapping their whole team. So some of these have to be kind of BS. Some of these have to seem to have a little more validity. And come the draft, it'll be interesting to see how all that shakes out. Now, our friends over at Predline had some interesting ideas. Michael Boddicker is apparently a free agent that the Preds are interested in. Also, Doug, one of the big writers over there, made the case that the NHL Central might not be as strong next season. I encourage you to check that one out. My own feelings are on the matter. You can never fully tell until the teams have kind of fleshed their rosters out. Obviously, there's always going to be changes. But I honestly think that it's still going to be about as strong. It might be a different kind of division. You might not necessarily have the bone-crunching hockey that you've seen in recent years. Chicago looks like they're trying to get a little bit faster. Obviously, if they keep Shaw, they're wanting to keep some of that edge to their game. St. Louis Blues are almost certainly going to have a different look next year, whether it's minus David Backes, minus Brouwer, minus whoever. They're going to have a different look. The Minnesota Wild, I don't know what their lineup is going to look like in terms of changes, but they're going to have a different style of play with Bruce Boudreau coming in there. Scott Stevens shoring up the defense. The Winnipeg Jets, who knows what you can do with them. I mean, that we're going to talk about that here in just a second, but there's only room to go up for them. And the Colorado Avalanche have the talent. They just need to kind of get some sort of game plan as to what they're wanting to do with all that. It's an interesting article. I encourage you to check it out, but I don't necessarily agree on the surface. The Colorado Avalanche sent a pretty loud message last week. Tyson Barrie is not going to, or Ty Barrie, excuse me, is not going to be traded away, at least according to General Manager Joe Sakic, but we know how all that works because not necessarily with Sakic specifically, but we've seen these kind of things where players, oh, no, there's no way we're ever going to deal him away, and then a week later they're on a different team. So you don't know how those proclamations always work out, but it'll be kind of interesting with Joe Sakic basically taking one of his big trade pieces off the market. We're going to see how that works out. Sakic's also playing a little bit of a game of chicken with a lot of his free agents, including RFA Nathan MacKinnon. It's going to be interesting to see how all that works out. I don't see the sense that it would make. Obviously, you don't want to overpay. And I understand that Sakic and Patrick Waugh are wanting to see a little bit more out of some of these younger players that are playing in Colorado, and maybe this is kind of the way that they're sending that message that we don't necessarily think we're going to pay you a lot of money because we want you to do more and earn that money. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. You don't want to just give players money just to be, oh, we don't want you to leave. You don't want a situation like that. But Nathan MacKinnon is still one of their top guns. You don't want him getting ticked off and walking out the door. Obviously, the Avalanche would get something back since he's a restricted free agent, but it still seems like a little bit of a dangerous game to play. Lastly, the Winnipeg Jets are the Winnipeg Jets. Not a ton of news. They, again, are just kind of interested in Andrew Ladd at this point. I'm sure if you live in Winnipeg, you're hearing a lot more rumblings, but just in terms of searching the internet for kind of stuff, there's really not a whole lot going on in terms of the Winnipeg Jets. But they've got a lot of cap space. I looked up their cap as of right now, and this could change depending on how much the cap goes up, whether it goes down, whether it stays the same. They have anywhere between $15 and $20 million, though, to spend. Whether or not they can afford to spend all that, I don't know. I don't know their ownership situation. Obviously, to get the fan base that they've got, they have to be putting a little bit into the team, and they're trying to win. They've done reasonably well. They didn't make it wasn't that long ago that they made the playoffs, but it's just that even though I don't necessarily care for any of the teams individually, it is kind of a sad state of affairs that so many Canadian teams are just not very good right now, and the Winnipeg Jets kind of fall into that category. But they've got the money. I wouldn't be surprised to see them take at least a stab at some of these bigger name free agents, try to bring them in, try to kind of convince them, hey, you can kind of be the linchpin, and then we can put a lot of decent lower price talent around you and see whether or not that sells. Likely it would not, but sometimes you just have to kind of see whether or not those things can work out for you. That'll do it for this week's edition of the Bleeding Blue look at the NHL Central. Hopefully you'll join us again next week. Should have some really interesting things to discuss as the draft is going to go down. We'll kind of see how everybody shook out in terms of that, whether anybody was making trades or just picking where they stood. Hope to see you next time, but until then, I'll see you then.